Aliens abandoned a crashed starship on Earth. Humans rebuilt it into a galactic superweapon. Part 1. The desert had not changed much in 1,000 years. It was flat and dry and cracked, and the sun hit it hard every day without apology. But on a Tuesday morning in the spring of 2031, something fell out of the sky and changed it forever. The object came in fast, too fast for any aircraft to follow. Radar stations across 3 states picked it up at the same moment, and none of them could agree on what they were looking at. It was large, larger than anything man-made that had ever flown, and it was moving at a speed that should have turned it into vapor when it hit the upper atmosphere. Instead it slowed, not all the way, but enough to survive. It punched through the clouds in a straight line, left a trail of burning air behind it, and hit the Nevada desert floor like a hammer on a drum. The impact tore a trench 3 miles long. The shock wave cracked windows in Las Vegas. The dust cloud it threw up could be seen from space. Colonel Dan Holt was eating breakfast in an Air Force Base cafeteria when his phone rang. 40 minutes later he was on a helicopter, and 3 hours after that he was standing at the edge of the trench, looking down at something that no one on Earth had ever seen up close before. The ship was massive. It sat in the trench at a slight angle, one end buried deeper than the other, its hull torn open in several places from the impact. It was dark gray, almost black, and the metal did not look like any metal Dan had ever seen. It had a quality to it that was hard to describe, like it was absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. There were no windows, no visible doors, no markings of any kind. It was smooth where it was not torn, and the torn edges did not look like broken metal. They looked like broken stone. Dan stood there for a long time without saying anything. Behind him, a team of military engineers was already setting up equipment. There were people running cables, people taking photographs, people in hazmat suits waving instruments at the air. Everyone was moving fast and talking into radios and trying to look like they knew what they were doing. Dan was the only one standing still. He had been in aerospace for 22 years. He had worked on every serious aircraft program the United States had run in that time. He knew what human engineering looked like, and he knew what the limits of it were. What was in that trench was not human engineering. And it was not close to the limits of anything. 2 days later, Dr. Laura Kim arrived on site. She was 31 years old and had a PhD in propulsion physics from Caltech. She had spent the last 4 years working on next-generation rocket engine designs that were, by the standards of the time, genuinely impressive. She had published papers that older scientists had called bold. She drove a car that was held together mostly by optimism and had a habit of writing equations on napkins and leaving them in restaurants. When she first saw the ship, she sat down in the dirt. She did not sit down because she was tired. She sat down because her legs stopped working correctly for a moment. She stared at the vessel for nearly a minute without blinking, and then she took out a notebook and started writing. The third key person to arrive was not a scientist. Pete Garrison had retired from the Navy 4 years earlier after 26 years as a machinist and systems specialist. He had worked on submarine reactors, naval propulsion systems, and a number of projects that still had classified designations. He was 53 years old, wide in the shoulders, and almost entirely unbothered by things that other people found intimidating. When he walked up to the trench and looked down at the wreck, he tilted his head slightly, the way a man does when he is looking at an engine that is misbehaving. The site was locked down fast and hard. A perimeter was established, then a larger one. Roads were closed. A cover story about a downed military aircraft was released to the press, and it held for about 6 hours before satellite images from 3 different countries appeared online and the cover story quietly stopped being used. The official position became no comment, which was not a confirmation but was not a denial either, and after a week the news cycle moved on to other things while the real work continued behind fences that were not on any public map. Dan Holt was put in charge of the recovery and study operation, which was given the name Project Foundry. The choice of name was his. He explained it to nobody. The first week was mostly about getting close without getting killed. There was radiation coming off the wreck, but it was not the kind anyone was familiar with. It did not match any known signature. The hazmat teams flagged it as low-level but unknown, which was not a reassuring category. Sensors were set up around the perimeter and data was collected around the clock. On day 9, Dan Holt walked into the wreck for the first time. He wore a protective suit and carried a flashlight and a radio. Laura Kim was beside him. Pete Garrison was behind them both. They moved slowly, stepping over torn hull sections and pieces of internal structure that had been scattered by the impact. The inside of the ship was dark and cold. The air was stale in a way that was hard to explain, not unpleasant exactly, but empty, like air that had been sitting sealed for a very long time. There were no bodies. There was no blood, no personal equipment, nothing that suggested a crew had ever been present. The ship had no sleeping quarters, no food storage, no cockpit in any recognizable sense. It had been built to run without people. Pete pointed his flashlight at a section of the interior wall and said nothing for a moment. Then he said, quietly, that whoever built this had thrown it away like an old soda can. Dan did not respond. He was looking at something deeper in the ship, a section that had survived the impact with less damage than the rest. There was a faint glow coming from it, a very soft blue, barely visible in the dark. They found the data core on day 11. It was a roughly cylindrical object, about the size of a car engine, embedded in a section of the hull that had not been breached. It was still powered, drawing energy from somewhere inside itself, and it was broadcasting on a frequency that human instruments were not designed to pick up. The only reason they found the signal at all was because Pete Garrison had rigged a broad-spectrum receiver out of components from 3 different pieces of equipment and left it running overnight. It took Laura 2 more days to pull the signal into a range that could be analyzed. And then it took another day of work, late into the night, with a translation attempt that was really more of an educated guess than anything else, before a sentence came through that was coherent. Laura printed it and handed it to Dan without speaking. It read, "Unit decommissioned. Disposal complete. No further retrieval scheduled." Dan read it twice. Then he set it face down on the folding table they had set up outside the trench. He looked at the ship, at the trench, at the dark sky above the desert. Then he said that they should see what they could do with the trash. Laura picked the printout back up. She read it again. Then she went back inside the wreck with her notebook. Pete poured himself a coffee and followed her in. Aliens abandoned a crashed starship on Earth. Humans rebuilt it into a galactic superweapon. Part 2. The second year was harder than the first, and the first had been very hard. Project Foundry grew slowly and carefully. New people were brought in one at a time, chosen not just for their skills but for what Pete Garrison called the right kind of stubborn. The kind of person who, when something did not work, did not walk away. They sat down and thought about why, and then they tried again differently. The site expanded as well. What had been a collection of tents and portable generators became a proper facility, low buildings half buried in the desert to avoid satellite detection, connected by covered walkways and surrounded by layers of security that got more serious the closer you got to the wreck. The wreck itself was now called the ship, which was not a very creative name but was accurate. Some of the team had taken to calling her the old girl, which Dan Holt discouraged in official communications but made no effort to stop in conversation. Dr. Calvin Price arrived in the middle of the second year. He was a materials scientist from MIT, 45 years old, thin, with the kind of intense focus that made some people uncomfortable. He had spent his career studying exotic alloys and had a reputation for being able to look at a broken piece of metal and tell you what had gone wrong and why. When he first took a sample cutter to the hull plating of the ship, the diamond-edged blade skated off the surface without leaving a mark, and Calvin sat down on a supply crate and laughed for a solid 2 minutes. It was not the laughter of someone who found something funny. It was the laughter of someone who had just seen the most interesting thing of their entire life. He spent the next 6 months doing nothing but studying the hull material. He ran tests that no one else fully understood. He filled notebooks with analysis and covered 3 whiteboards with equations that he refused to erase. At the end of those 6 months, he knew what the material was doing at the molecular level. He did not yet know how to replicate it, but he knew what he was trying to replicate, which he said was the important part. Nina Shaw came in that same year. She was 28 and had been working on AI-driven navigation systems for satellites. She was quiet in groups and very loud when she had something to say. Her job was to attempt a translation of the ship's operating language, which she later described as trying to learn to read by only ever finding receipts and instruction manuals. The analogy was more precise than it sounded. The ship's data core contained no literature, no history, no communication between individuals. It contained logs, system reports, and maintenance records. It was useful only in the way that a parts manual is useful, full of information, but nothing warm in it. Nina did not let that stop her. She built translation tools from scratch, layer by layer, testing each piece against the data she had and refining when the output came out as noise. It was slow work and the early results were barely readable, but by the end of the second year she had a working vocabulary of roughly 400 terms and a rough grasp of the language's grammar. She printed her progress report and pinned it to the wall above her workstation with a note that said "not bad for receipts." The propulsion system was Laura's obsession. She had understood what it was doing within the first few weeks of study, which was modulating gravity at the subatomic level to generate thrust. She had understood the theory for years. Physicists had been sketching versions of it on whiteboards since before she was born. But seeing an actual working implementation, even a broken one, was something else entirely. It was like having spent years reading descriptions of fire and then suddenly standing in front of a furnace. She spent 4 months simply looking at it. Not testing it, not dismantling it. Just looking, sketching diagrams, and thinking. Pete Garrison checked on her regularly and brought her coffee and did not ask questions she was not ready to answer. Dent Holt gave her the time without comment. He had learned, in the first year, that some kinds of progress looked exactly like stillness from the outside. The first attempt to power on a section of the ship nearly ended the project before it had properly begun. Pete Garrison had identified a capacitor array near the ship's secondary systems bay and had run a careful analysis suggesting it was inert. The analysis was almost correct. When power was applied through a test conduit, the array discharged through a path that Pete had not accounted for, and the resulting surge went through 2 of his technicians and through Pete himself. The technicians were knocked off their feet and shaken but unharmed. Pete's hands were burned badly enough to require treatment, and he had ringing in his ears for 3 weeks. He was back at the site the following Monday. Nobody told him to come back. Nobody would have dared to tell him to stay home. He arrived in the morning, had his bandaged hands looked at by the site medic, accepted a coffee from Nina Shaw, and went back to the secondary systems bay to continue the analysis from where it had stopped. The second and third attempts went better. Not perfectly, but better. Small sections of the ship began responding to controlled power input. Lights came on in the forward section, a faint amber glow that had not been there since the crash. A low hum started somewhere deep in the hull, felt more than heard, a vibration that moved through the floor and up through the soles of your boots. It was the kind of sound that made people stop talking and look at each other. Calvin cracked the whole material problem late in the second year. He had been working on a synthetic alloy of his own design, built from terrestrial materials but structured at the molecular level to mimic the behavior of the alien plating. It was not as strong as the original, not even close, but it could be manufactured in a facility on Earth with existing equipment. He called it the first step, and he was right. The gap between step 1 and the original was enormous, but the direction was clear. Nina submitted her first full translation of a ship system log in the 22nd month of the project. It was a maintenance record for the navigation array, dry and technical, but reading it felt like reading a letter from another world, because it was. The log described systems in terms that Nina had to construct entirely new vocabulary to express. Concepts that had no human equivalent. She worked late on the translation, alone in her section of the facility, and when she finished she sat back in her chair and was quiet for a long time. Then she started on the next one. By the end of the third year, the ship was responding. Not fully, not even half of its systems were operational, but it was no longer just a wreck. It had become something else. A project. A puzzle that was slowly showing its own solution. Dent Holt stood on the hull one cold Nevada night, the desert dark in every direction, the stars very sharp and close. Pete was beside him. Both of them could feel the hum coming up through the metal beneath their feet. Pete said that she was waking up. Dent looked at the sky for a moment before he answered. Then he said that they were waking her up. There was a difference, and it mattered to him that the difference be said out loud. Pete thought about that. Then he finished his coffee and said that either way, it was a good sign. Dan agreed. It was. Aliens abandoned a crashed starship on Earth. Humans rebuilt it into a galactic superweapon. Part 3. In the 6th year of Project Foundry, Nina Shaw sent a message into space. It was not an accident and it was not authorized through any official channel above the project level. It was the logical next step in work she had been doing for years, and she had laid out the reasoning in a clear 2-page memo to Dan Holt 3 weeks before she did it. Dan had read the memo, asked 2 questions, received 2 clear answers, and told her to go ahead. He did not tell anyone above his clearance level that it was happening. He decided it was easier to apologize after than to wait for approval that might never come. The signal Nina sent was a formatted handshake protocol. She had built it herself from patterns she had identified in the alien data core over years of study. It was designed to identify itself as a deliberate communication rather than natural noise, to show that the sender understood the basic structure of the language it was using. It was not a translation of anything specific. It was closer to standing in a foreign country and saying hello in the local language. Simple, careful, just enough to be understood. The team sent it and went home for the weekend. 14 hours later, a response came in. It did not come from the direction they had transmitted toward. Nina was the one who saw it first. She had come in early on the Saturday morning, not because she expected anything, but because she always came in early. She was making coffee when her monitoring system flagged an incoming signal on the same frequency band. She set the coffee down and sat at her console and spent 20 minutes confirming that what she was seeing was real before she called Dan Holt at home. Dan arrived at the site in 35 minutes. Laura and Pete were already there by the time he walked in. The signal took 3 days to decode fully. It was not encrypted in any hostile sense. It was simply dense, layered, built for a receiver with a much deeper understanding of the language than Nina currently had. She worked through it in pieces, using every translation tool she had built and several she assembled on the spot. Calvin Price sat beside her for most of day 2, not because he could help with the translation but because he wanted to see what came out. What came out was a name and an explanation. The senders called themselves the Verith Collective. They were a coalition of 7 civilizations, and they had been watching the crash site from a distance since the year of the impact. They had watched through sensors that humanity's instruments could not detect, and what they had watched, for 6 years, was a primitive species doing something that primitive species were not supposed to do. The Verith Collective had assumed, at first, that the humans would take the crashed vessel apart for the metal. This was the standard behavior pattern for a species at Earth's level of development. They would salvage what was useful, study a little of what they found, and eventually give up on the parts they could not understand. The crash site would become a curiosity, maybe a tourist location, and then time would bury it. Instead, the humans had turned on the ship's communication array and transmitted a coherent handshake protocol in the ship's own language. In the Verith Collective's words, as Nina translated them slowly and carefully, this was deeply unexpected. Dan Holt read the translation and said nothing for a long moment. Then he asked if deeply unexpected was as close to alarmed as the translation could get. Nina thought about it and said yes, probably. The communication between Earth and the Verith Collective took place over the following weeks, relayed through the ship's array, translated by Nina and a small team she had put together to help her manage the workload. The Verith were cautious and formal and very precise in their language. They asked how the humans had achieved what they had achieved. They asked about the team, the methods, the timeline. Their questions were not unfriendly, but they had the quality of questions asked by someone who is trying to understand something that does not fit any category they have. Dan Holt answered honestly and briefly. He gave the broad outline without unnecessary detail. Then he asked the Verith Collective a question of his own. He asked why a civilization capable of faster-than-light travel had thrown a working starship into a gravity well and left it. There was a pause before the response came. The pause was long enough that Nina checked twice to make sure the connection was still active. The Verith explained that the ship had not been working. It had been damaged in a conflict and assessed as beyond economical repair by the civilization that originally built it. It had been disposed of in a remote system with no significant population. The third planet of that system had not been considered a relevant factor. Dan Holt read the response. Then he asked what economical meant to a civilization with faster-than-light travel. Another pause. Through the Verith, the team began to understand the shape of the galaxy they had been living inside without knowing it. It was old and crowded and not especially welcoming to species that were just beginning to reach beyond their own atmosphere. There were established powers with long histories and deep resources. There were agreements between them, loose ones, maintained not by any formal structure but by the simple fact that several civilizations were capable of catastrophic violence and everyone was aware of it. New species entered this environment carefully, if they were smart, and accepted a kind of protected status that kept them safe but also kept them small. Humanity had not been given the option to accept or refuse this arrangement, because humanity had not been considered developed enough to contact. That had been the plan. The plan had changed. The Verith Collective told Earth's representatives that the correct procedure was to register with the Galactic Council, accept protected status as an emerging civilization, and surrender the vessel for proper and final disposal. The message was delivered politely. It was clearly intended as advice from a more experienced party to a less experienced one. It had the tone of someone explaining traffic laws to a person who had just moved to a new city. The official response from the human side took 72 hours to draft. It went through several versions. The first version was not polite. The final version was polite, but only technically. Nina transmitted it on a Thursday afternoon. It was 2 words. The translation software rendered them, as accurately as it could manage, as, respectfully, no. The Verith Collective did not respond for 11 days. When they did, the message was longer and more careful than anything they had sent before. It contained information about the wider galaxy that the Verith had not shared until then. And the information was not reassuring. Aliens abandoned a crashed starship on Earth. Humans rebuilt it into a galactic superweapon. Part 4. The Keth Dominion was old. That was the first thing the Verith explained, and it was the thing that mattered most. They had been expanding for 600 years. Not quickly, not in dramatic bursts, but steadily, the way water moves through stone. A system here, a region there, absorbing what they found and moving on. They did not destroy the civilizations they encountered, not usually. They absorbed them. The civilization continued to exist in a technical sense, its people still living and working, but its decisions were no longer its own. Its resources flowed outward, toward the center of the Dominion. Its identity faded over generations, and after long enough it was simply part of the Keth, as if it had always been. 2 civilizations had resisted. They were now silent. Not destroyed, the Verith said carefully, just silent. No signals. No contact. No indication of what had become of them. The Galactic Council had done nothing. The Keth Dominion operated inside the boundaries of what the established powers defined as acceptable behavior, and changing those definitions was a long and difficult process that nobody had managed in over 200 years. The Council was very good at talking. It was not very good at the other things. The outer spiral arm, where Earth's solar system sat, was the direction the Dominion was moving. Dan Holt absorbed all of this over several sessions with the Verith translations, reading the material carefully, asking questions, asking Nina to ask follow-up questions and then reading those answers carefully too. When he had read everything the Verith had shared, he called a meeting of the Project Foundry leadership team and laid it out plainly. He did not dramatize it. He did not soften it. He said what the situation was in simple language, and then he asked what the team thought should be done. The conversation that followed was long and not always comfortable. Some people on the team had joined Project Foundry because it was the most interesting scientific problem in human history. The shift from scientific project to something with a weapons purpose sat poorly with a few of them, and they said so clearly and were heard out fully. The concerns were real and Dan Holt did not dismiss them. Laura Kim said almost nothing for the first hour of the meeting. She sat at the end of the table and listened to everyone else. Then, when there was a pause, she spoke. She did not argue for building a weapon. She asked one question. She asked what the team thought would happen to the people of Earth if they did nothing. She did not wait for an answer. She said she thought they all already knew, and then she said she was going back to work. The meeting ended shortly after. The project shifted. It did not shift overnight, and it did not shift completely. The scientific work continued because it had to. You could not build a weapons system from technology you did not understand, and understanding this technology was a process that had no shortcuts. But the direction changed. The questions being asked were different now. Not only how does this work, but what can it do, and how do we make it do more? Calvin Price had been developing his synthetic alloy for 4 years. It was now at a point where it could be manufactured in meaningful quantities and worked with using tools that had been modified for the purpose. It was still not as strong as the alien hull plating, but Calvin had a new idea. He had been running experiments on what happened when the two materials were used together. Layers of his synthetic alloy bonded to the original alien plating in specific configurations. The results were surprising. The combination performed better than either material alone. It was not a sum. It was something more than a sum. He spent 3 months working out why, and another month working out how to control it deliberately rather than stumbling onto it by accident. By the end of that process, the ship had a new outer hull reinforcement layer that was stronger than the original and could be repaired using equipment that existed on Earth. Nina rewrote the targeting software from scratch. The original targeting system was built around the Keth's own combat doctrine and around sensory equipment designed for a crew with different biology than humans. It worked, technically, but it was slow by Nina's standards and it made assumptions about the environment that were not always correct. She spent 8 months dismantling it at the code level, understanding each piece, and then setting it aside. Then she spent 4 more months building a new system from the ground up. Her system was designed for human operators, built around sensors that the Project Foundry team had modified and improved over years, and tuned for speed in a way the original had not been. When she ran the first live test of it, the improvement in response time was significant enough that Laura asked her to run it again to make sure the instruments were correct. They were correct. Pete Garrison's contribution was the one that impressed people most, possibly because it looked the most impossible. The ship's power distribution system had been designed to work with internal components that were alien in origin and partly still not fully understood. Pete needed to connect new systems, human-built systems, to this alien network without destroying either side. It should not have worked. The two technologies did not speak the same language at the hardware level. The tolerances were different. The materials were different. The fundamental assumptions about how power moved through a system were different. Pete spent 6 months making it work anyway. His method was partly engineering and partly instinct built from 30 years of working with machines that were older and stranger than they looked. He treated the alien components, as he explained it to anyone who asked, like a very complicated marine diesel engine. Something old. Something that had its own ideas about how things should be done. Something you had to understand on its own terms before you could ask it to do something new. When the integrated power system ran its first full test, delivering output across both the alien and human-built sections of the ship without a fault, Pete sat on the floor of the engineering bay for a moment with his eyes closed. Then he got up and made a note in his log and moved on to the next problem. Late in the 4th year, the team voted on a name for the ship. The government designation was a string of letters and numbers that no one used. The team had been calling the ship different things informally over the years, the old girl most often, but that was a term of affection rather than a name. It was decided that a real name was appropriate, given what the ship had become. The vote was anonymous. The winning name came in with more than 2/3 of the ballot. The name was Patient Zero. Nobody officially explained the reasoning. It did not need explanation. Among the team, the meaning was understood without discussion. This was the first. It was the beginning of something that did not have a name yet. And it had started here, in the Nevada desert, with a piece of trash that nobody else had wanted. Dan Holt approved the name without comment. The stenciling was done in English on the port side of the hull, and in Nina's best reconstruction of the alien script on the starboard side. Patient Zero was ready. Not completely ready. There were still systems that were only partly functional and corners of the ship that nobody fully understood. But ready enough. Ready in the way a thing is ready when it has been prepared as well as it possibly can be and the time for preparation is running out. The Verith Collective sent a message in the final week of that year. The Keth Dominion had dispatched a survey vessel toward the Outer Arm. Aliens abandoned a crashed starship on Earth. Humans rebuilt it into a galactic superweapon. Part 5. The alert came in at 4 in the morning. Nina Shaw was already awake. She had not slept well in the 2 weeks since the Verith message had confirmed what everyone was quietly expecting. The monitoring systems she had built to watch the signal environment around the solar system had flagged an incoming object at 4:08 a.m., and by 4:11 a.m. she had confirmed it was broadcasting on a frequency that matched the Keth Dominion signature she had spent months cataloging from old data in the ship's core. She called Den Holt. He picked up on the second ring. 1 hour later, the core team was assembled in the main operations room. The Keth vessel was still 2 days out from the inner solar system, moving at a speed that suggested it was not trying to hide. It was broadcasting a territorial claim on all detectable frequencies, a standard Dominion message that Nina had translated in full within the first hour. The message said, in the formal language of the Dominion, that this system was being assessed for integration into the Keth territorial zone. All inhabitants were advised to make themselves known and to take no actions that could be interpreted as resistance. The message was calm and thorough and had the quality of a form letter, something sent so many times it had stopped feeling like a communication and had become more like a procedure. Dan Holt read the translation. Then he looked at Nina and asked how far out the Keth vessel was. Nina told him. Dan nodded. Then he said it was time. The launch preparations had been tested 3 times in the past year, but never with the full intention of actually going. The difference was immediately apparent. People moved faster. Voices were quieter. The kind of nervous energy that is different from excitement, more serious, more aware of what is real. Pete Garrison ran a full diagnostic of the power distribution system while his team ran through the pre-launch sequence. Everything was nominal, which was a word that meant normal but which felt, on this particular morning, like the most significant word in the English language. Laura Kim was at the propulsion station, her hands moving across the control interface she had spent 2 years designing, checking outputs and making small adjustments with the fluency of someone who had spent more time thinking about these systems than she had spent sleeping. Dan Holt took his position at the command console. He looked around the room once, at the faces of people who had given years of their lives to this moment, and did not make a speech. There was nothing to say that the room did not already know. Patient Zero launched from the Nevada site under her own power for the first time. The launch was not quiet. It tore a new furrow down the length of the desert floor and punched through the upper atmosphere with a force that rattled every seismograph in the western United States. From the ground, the streak of light left behind was visible from 3 states and was caught on phone cameras by hundreds of people who had no idea what they were watching. Inside the ship, the crew felt the acceleration as a pressure rather than a movement. The alien gravity systems that Laura had spent years understanding spread the force evenly through the ship's structure and the people inside it. What should have been crushing became instead a steady, firm presence, like the feeling of water against the body in a deep pool. The Keth survey vessel was not a warship. That was the first important thing. It was an assessment ship, sent to evaluate a target before the formal process of integration began. It had standard defensive systems built for encounters with species at or below the tier the Dominion expected to find in this region. It was well equipped for what it had been sent to do. It had not been sent to do this. Patient Zero came up out of the gravity well of Earth and oriented toward the incoming Keth vessel in a movement that took less than 40 seconds. The distance between them was large but not, by the standards of the technology now available to the ship, very significant. The Keth vessel's sensors detected Patient Zero almost immediately and the Dominion broadcast stopped for a moment, which was unusual, before resuming with a new message. The new message was a demand for identification and an instruction to cease approach. Nina Shaw transmitted the response. She had written it herself, 3 months earlier, in the quiet of a late evening when she had been thinking about what she would say if this moment came. She had revised it several times. The final version was short. It said that the ship approaching was the property of the inhabitants of the 3rd planet, Sol system. It said that the ship had been built by a neighbor of the Keth Dominion, disposed of in the Sol system, and recovered by the inhabitants there. It said that the inhabitants had taken it apart to understand how it worked and had put it back together in a way they were satisfied with. And it said that the Keth survey vessel was welcome to leave, and that the Dominion was encouraged to tell others what it had seen here today. There was a silence. On the instruments, the Keth vessel was visible as a clear signal, holding position. The silence lasted 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Then the Keth vessel turned. It did not turn slowly. It oriented away from Patient Zero and away from Earth with the speed of something that has made a decision and intends to carry it out without discussion. Its engines lit up on the sensor display and it moved, fast, in the direction it had come from. Within 20 minutes it was no longer visible to the ship's forward sensors. On the operations deck of Patient Zero, nobody said anything for a long moment. Pete Garrison was the first to speak. He said, in a voice that was carefully matter-of-fact, that he thought that had gone well. Someone in the back of the room laughed. And then several other people laughed, and the tension in the room broke apart and became something else, lighter and different, the particular feeling of a group of people who have just discovered that a thing they were afraid of has turned out to be survivable. Dan Holt did not laugh. He sat at the command console and watched the sensor display for a long time, until the Keth vessel's signal was entirely gone. Then he leaned back and looked at the ceiling for a moment. What the Keth survey vessel reported to the Dominion High Command took weeks to reach the relevant decision-makers, and the implications took longer still to work through. A species that had barely achieved orbital spaceflight a decade ago had produced, from a discarded wreck, a vessel that had turned a Dominion survey ship around without a single weapon being fired. The mathematics of what that implied were not complicated to anyone who understood them. If they had built one, they would build more. And they understood the technology in a way that only comes from taking something completely apart and putting it back together. The Verith Collective reached out within a month. Their message was warmer than previous communications and included, for the first time, something that translated approximately as congratulations. 3 other civilizations sent cautious messages of introduction within the following months. 2 of them had long-standing disagreements with the Keth Dominion and did not explain their interest in Earth directly, but the interest was clear. The Galactic Council sent a formal request that Earth accept an observer seat on the Council, a status that had not been offered to a species as young as humanity in over 300 years. The request was phrased carefully, as if the Council was not entirely sure how to address a species that had just done what humanity had done, and was trying to find the right tone. On Earth, Project Foundry was expanding. A larger facility was already under construction in the Nevada desert, built around everything the team had learned over 7 years. The designs for 3 more ships were in development, drawing on the principles that Patient Zero had demonstrated and improving them with everything that had been learned since. On a clear evening shortly after the construction began, Laura Kim stood at the edge of the old trench. The scar in the earth was still there, 3 miles long, a reminder of the morning in 2031 when something had fallen from the sky and changed everything. She stood at the edge of it and looked at the sky as the last light faded and the stars came through. Pete Garrison came up beside her with a coffee in one hand and a set of blueprints under his arm. The blueprints were covered in his handwriting, in the margins and across the corners, notes and calculations and small diagrams that only made sense to him. He stood there for a moment and then said that they really had just thrown it away. Laura said yes. Pete thought about that. Then he said lucky for them. She looked at the stars for a little while longer. At the ones that were simply stars, and at the ones that were not. She said that yes, it was lucky for all of them. Then she picked up her own notebook and went back to work.